So, in part one of this series, I mentioned that in my research on cauldrons, I had fallen down some rabbit holes that warranted further investigation. So, some of this is archaeological, actually, it mostly is. And I'll admit that I haven't gone into depth in studying the archaeology side of it. It's just something I'm excited about, and I wanted to share it with you, and I'll try to explain why. So maybe that will whet your own appetite to follow these leads up for yourselves a little bit. Before we get into the video, please let me take about 1 minute to tell you how you can win a free online class by joining me for some festive fun here on YouTube. For the third year running, I'll be posting a video every day over the holiday period, a tradition known as the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology. It starts just after the winter solstice on 22nd December. This year's theme is the voyages of the Brans. We'll be exploring the two voyages of the Irish King Bran and the voyage of the Welsh King Bran, and we'll be looking at some obscure texts and fascinating footnotes of Celtic mythology in the process. Like last year, I'll be asking a question during each session. These are what do you think type questions, and all you need to do is put a little bit of thought into your answer and put it in the comments each day. Last year, there were 4 winners. 2 were people who'd never taken a class with me before. Anybody can get in on this. If you'd like to be even more involved, you can come to the daily live discussions simply by signing up as a patron, even at the $2 level. It won't affect your chances of winning one way or the other, but it will give you a taste of what my classes are like for a very small investment. Okay, back to the video. So, you may be familiar with the early Celtic culture of the Hallstatt period, which has some very rich tomb burials, which include wagons and large vessels. We looked at this burial from V last time, where the woman had a very large wine vessel and serving accessories. And this tomb from Hochdorf, from around the same time, is another very high status individual, a man this time, probably royalty. At the back of the photo here in this museum reconstruction, you can see the body laid on a bronze couch with a very large vessel at his foot and serving dishes in the foreground. So here's a closer look at that vessel, which has these beautiful lions on the rim and a golden bowl. And this cauldron contains traces of mead. If it was even half filled, that's a lot of mead. This was a rich man. So the culture which came before the Hallstatt culture in this part of Europe is usually called the Urnfield culture. The Urnfield culture gets its name because these people created large cemeteries which contained cremated remains buried in urns. A single individual often had other urns surrounding the one with the cremated remains, and these other urns contained items of value or offerings of some kind. And some of these burials contained what came to be known as cult wagons. And these are found more in the Balto-Slavic areas. So they're not entirely Celtic, but they're really interesting, and I feel like they're worth looking at. So this image that I've been teasing you with is a cult wagon. In the drawing, it looks huge, but it's only about a foot high or 35 centimeters high. And it's essentially a very fancy burial urn. So where we see Hallstatt elites buried with actual wagons, earlier we see elite cremations actually placed in these small wagons sometimes. However, the thing that really caught my attention is the decoration, not the fact that it has wheels. So this is the detail up close. So you can see both birds on the supports of the vessel and also decorating the vessel. Now they look like water birds, ducks or something. The style of these wagons is really varied. The older one here on the left doesn't even have a vessel. It's much more symbolic. It says here that the bones and the ashes were buried underneath this. So this is still the thing that's supposed to take the buried individual who may have perhaps been lower status, or maybe it's just the beginning of the idea. It's 500 years earlier than some of the others. But these birds are a constant theme. You can see them here on near the sort of wheels of this wagon. And this one actually uses the bird. You see, it has a lid as a container for the ashes. So it's difficult to know exactly what was in the minds of these people. It seems like both the wagon and the birds have a function in carrying the dead. The combination of water birds and a wheeled vehicle is kind of hard to fathom. Like, why not a boat? Could the wheels represent a more earthbound funerary function, the carrying of the physical body, perhaps? And then the birds have maybe a psychopompic role carrying the soul? I don't know. Did the dead need to travel over water to reach their destination? Obviously, we don't know, but I want to head a bit further into the land of conjecture with you. Now, I can't stress enough that these people are not Celtic, but they're near neighbors with some similarities. Maybe a few of these are Celtic, and that's one of the things I haven't fully researched because they do reach into the Hallstatt period. Though there were certainly trade and travel and plenty of opportunity for exchange of ideas, individuals and populations were very mobile at this time. But we don't know what the early Celts thought about any of this. They might have looked at this stuff and laughed and said that their neighbors were terribly silly, and that's not what happens when you die at all. We don't know. They might have had very similar ideas. I can't think of any water birds in Welsh lore, but when we find water birds or what seem like water birds in Irish lore, they are often otherworldly. There are a few swan stories and sometimes birds which aren't really well described, like those in the story of the conception of Cuchulainn, which behave a lot like geese, tearing up the grass around Auanmacha, like some kinds of wild geese, and also cranes do. So they entice the Ulstermen to hunt them, leading them to the strange house where the birth of Cuchulainn takes place, which is clearly an otherworldly place and an otherworldly event. But there's no sign of these birds having a psychopompic function. They're just otherworldly. Crows, of course, can also be associated with death due to their visits to fallen warriors. But these birds seem to be something else. They're not corvids. So when I saw the birds on these cult wagons, of course, I thought about the birds of Rhiannon first. Now, I don't actually think that Rhiannon's birds are likely to be waterfowl. Their beautiful singing suggests songbirds of some kind, blackbirds, wrens, larks. There are many possibilities, but I don't think ducks and geese are on the short list somehow. Is it possible that over many centuries, psychopompic waterbirds could possibly become songbirds in the lore? I have some notions about that, but it's complicated and it might be better suited to a written piece than a video. What I think we can take away from this is a relationship between birds and funerary containers. But the Celts, in the Hallstatt period, they seem to be moving away from cremation for the elites. In the second branch of the Mabinogi, the story of the Cauldron of Rebirth is partly told as a flashback or memory, when Matholwch describes its origins to Bran at the wedding feast. So I'd like to look at the events surrounding the cauldron in their chronological order rather than the order they are told in the second branch, starting with Matholwch's tale. So Matholwch tells Bran, one day while out hunting in Ireland, I was on top of a tumulus above a lake in Ireland called the Lake of the Cauldron. Then I saw a large, reddish yellow-haired man coming out of the lake with a cauldron on his back, and a woman following after him. And large as he was, twice as big as him was the woman. They made their way towards me and greeted me. Aye, said I, how goes it with you? This is how it goes with us, Lord, he said. This woman, at the end of a month and a fortnight, will become pregnant, and the boy that will be born from that wombful after a month and a fortnight will be a fully armed fighting man. So Matholwch goes on to tell Bran about how the giants and their many offspring made themselves unwelcome due to the rudeness and their consumption of resources. So eventually a plan was devised by Matholwch and his people to kill the giants. The offspring perished, but the parents escaped. And there's no suggestion here that Matholwch understood the properties of the cauldron while the giants were with him. But Bran mentions it in their conversation. He says, the peculiarity of the cauldron is this: a man who is killed today and thrown into the cauldron, by the next day he will be as good as at his best, except that he will not be able to talk. So Bran knows that the cauldron came from Ireland as well. He says, it came to me from a man who is from your land, and for all I know, he may have acquired it there. Hlasar Hlais Gevuid. He came here from Ireland with his wife, Cemidi Cemainvol, together with him, and they had escaped from Ireland. And when the need arises, he gives Matholwch the cauldron as a gift, as part of his compensation after Matholwch's horses are mutilated. Later, when Bran invades Ireland to avenge his sister's mistreatment, and the battle ensues, Matholwch puts the cauldron to its intended use. The Irish and the Britons are fighting. Then the Irish began to kindle a fire under the cauldron of rebirth. The dead were thrown into the cauldron until it was full. They would rise up the next day, fighting men as good as before, except they would not be able to talk. And then when Evnissyan, he's the guy that caused all the trouble in the first place, when Evnissyan saw the dead bodies, he crawls in amongst the corpses of the Irishmen. And two bare-bottomed Irishmen come to him and throw him in the cauldron along with the others. He stretches himself out in the cauldron until the cauldron breaks into 4 pieces and his heart breaks as well. In other words, Evnissyan dies, destroying the cauldron. So this cauldron also seems to have its association with death and rebirth. I'm sure you're all familiar with this panel from the Gundestrup cauldron, a real actual cauldron, which appears to depict this scene or a similar concept, with the warriors being dipped into the cauldron and then riding away, ready to fight again. So the cauldron is destroyed, and soon the 7 Britons, who are the only survivors of this battle as far as their side goes, return to Wales, where they begin their strange, otherworldly feasting, which seems to have the function of saying goodbye to their fallen king, Bran, whose living, severed head joins them at his own funeral feast. Then they made for Harlech, and they began a feast. They began to eat and drink, and there came 3 birds, which began to sing a kind of song to them. And when they heard that song, every other seemed unlovely beside it. It seemed a distant sight, what they could see far above the ocean, yet it was as clear as if they had been right next to them, and they were at that feast for 7 years. As you probably know, these are the birds of Rhiannon. So we have birds following soon after the cauldron story. I've been thinking lately about what I call textual proximity. That's when things keep getting mentioned close to one another in various texts. So I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, because both birds, death, and cauldrons, and other vessels like cups are pretty common in Celtic stories. So I acknowledge that this may all be a coincidence. You've probably heard me mention before that Rhiannon's birds have a parallel in Ireland in the birds of Clina Fairhead, an otherworldly woman described in the story of Teg, son of Cian. So we'll just look at this episode. Teg and his men are on an otherworldly island. They've been having very strange adventures, and the island itself seems to be a place where a lot of dead people are going to go as a kind of afterlife. This is being described. Fortresses are there for kings of Ireland, and a new place of death is being created there for Christian dead in this Celtic otherworld. So it's a very curious episode in the story. Just then, they saw 3 birds fly in through an open window. One was blue with a crimson head, the next had a crimson body with a green head, and the third was pied and had a head the color of gold. So pied means black and white. They perched in the apple tree, and each ate one of the apples, and then began to sing the sweetest of melodies, all in harmony, such as would lull the sick to sleep. These birds will accompany you on your quest, said Clina. They will guide you, and their minstrelsy will raise your spirits until you reach Ireland again. Neither grief nor sadness will come to you. Take also this green cup with you. It has many powers, and if it is filled with water, it will become wine. Where have we heard about cauldrons that would do things similar? What is the history of this cup? Asked Teig. Soon told, replied the lady. This goblet was found in the heart of a whale, which washed up on our shores. Keep it in your grasp, for when you lose it, your death will not be far off. And in fact, she goes on then to predict how and where Teig will die. So we have the otherworldly birds. This is immediately followed by a cup with predictive or life-protecting properties. Now, we saw a cup with predictive properties in the story of Cormac in the Otherworld last time. And also we saw a lot of stuff about prediction of the truth and prognostication and so on. So the adventurers leave Clina's island after this conversation, accompanied by the birds. The birds go with them. So they're back on the sea. Their currach drove forward through the troughs of the sea, and the birds began to sing to them and lift up their hearts until they were merry and full of courage. Their craft continued on its way for a day and a half, but they were lulled into slumber by the singing of the birds, so that they knew nothing of the voyage until they reached the land of Freshen, which is, I think, meant to be like Friesland, although it's described as being near Spain. Then they awoke, and they saw that they were in a port, and the birds ceased their singing. I'm sure you know that the other reference to Rhiannon's birds occurs in Kilhach and Olwen, when the giant Ysbyddaden is listing the things he requires of Kilhach, and he asks for this: the birds of Rhiannon, the ones which can wake the dead and put the living to sleep. I want to entertain me that tonight. So very similar description to Clina's birds. Can you remember at all what's next on Ysbyddaden's long list of requests? Yes, it's the Cauldron of Diarnach Withel, which we looked at last time. Now, keep in mind that the wedding feast being planned by Ysbyddaden for Kilhach and his daughter Olwen will also be Ysbyddaden's funeral feast. Like Diarnach, the giant owner of the cauldron, and like Bran, the giant king of Britain, Ysbyddaden is due to be beheaded at his daughter's wedding. And this he's well aware of. It's not a surprise when it happens. So I hope you can see where I'm going with this idea of textual proximity. So Arthur crosses water to reach Diarnach's court, behead him, and steal his cauldron. Arthur also appears to cross water in his ship Prydwen for his raid on the otherworld, where many die, and where Diarnach's cauldron is mentioned. In the story of Clina and Teig, the birds appear before Clina gives Teig his death-predicting cup, and he sets out on a voyage over water accompanied by birds. So there may be nothing to see here. It may all be coincidence, or there may be meaning if you search for it. If you're enjoying this series, why not take one of my online classes? There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay-what-you-can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter, or follow me on my Patreon page.